Welcome, fellow freaks, geeks, and nostalgic peeps, to my channel, Slime and Slashers, where, we talk about everything from Nickelodeon slime to horror movie slashers, but plenty of stuff in between, including books. This is not just any old book-themed video. Nope, it is my top 10 of 2022 video, and I'm so pumped and excited to share with you guys my top 10 reads of last year. So without further ado, let's go to the short intro so we can get right into the flippin' top 10. Welcome back, guys! Okay, excuse all my shelves, they're basically empty behind me because I had to grab a lot of the books for videos I've been filming recently, including this video right now, because a lot of my favorite books were behind me on some of these shelves here. So, you will find out which books those are in just a second, but I do want to remind you, if you have not watched my recent Kelseys Choice Awards ceremony, I suggest you guys check that out because I put a lot of work into it and I think you'd enjoy it. I talk about a lot of books, a lot more books than I'm talking about today. In fact, some of the books today on my top 10 weren't even mentioned in the awards ceremony. So basically the idea of the awards ceremony was kind of like a fancier version of a reading survey, just talking about books that had certain strengths over other books, and we also had nominees for each category. So I talked about a lot of books in the span of about 58 minutes. I know it's a long video, but I think you can get a lot of book recs if you find that you have similar taste to me. You might want to check that video out because I talk about a lot of books that were mostly 4, 4.5, 5-star reads for me. And, you know, I basically give out awards for the zaniest book, the most emotional book, the funniest book, the most surprising book, the most shocking book, all kinds of stuff like that. Also, I gave out an award for my favorite paperback from hell read from 2022, you know. And also, I have just a whole bunch of random stuff in addition to that, too. It's not only about vintage stuff, it's about vintage and newer horror, and even some non-horror books are discussed as well. But without further ado, let's stop talking about that other video and get into today's video. So we're going to start right off with number 10. Ew, this is so hard. Alright, so number 10 for me from 2022 has to be Toady. And this is my only 4.5-star read that made it onto my top 10 list. And the reason. So let me clarify why it's not a perfect 5. So this version of the book is the British version. There's also an American version of this book called The Horror Club. That one is about 200 pages less. So what this one has that the other one does not have and the other one cuts out is about 200 pages that is about a fantasy kind of element that develops in the story. For the American version, they cut out that whole fantasy side plot, which I'd be kind of interested to read that other version just to see how, you know, it all ties together without that section in the book. So this book had that section, and that wasn't my favorite part of the book. However, it's still one of the books that I remember the most, that I had the most fun reading, and that had the best horror imagery that I read in all of 2022. Plus, it had a really great atmosphere as well. This book follows a group of friends, including one of them. His name is Toady. And Toady contacts something he's really not supposed to and kind of unleashes an evil in this seaside town during winter time. Another thing that makes this unique, again, is that it's a coming-of-age story, but it's set in winter. Most of the time, you either have a coming-of-age story that's set in summer or that takes place throughout a whole year. This one basically takes place just in the winter. Very unusual for a coming-of-age book. This is also an old-school book, so it's not really a newer book. This is from the 80s. And I will tell you the exact year right now. This was published in 1989, and I just have nothing but good things to say about it. Even with that little section, it wasn't terrible, it just wasn't my favorite part of the book. I thought the book could have kept going the way it was going without veering off into this fantasy element. However, I still think it's one of the best paperbacks from hell I've read, period. It's still one of the most appealing books I've read in terms of I could really picture the descriptions in the book, and it was really very spooky at times, the things that were being described. Very just unique descriptions of these scenes unusual horror elements that I don't see in any other book usually. So I think this is super underrated. It's almost criminally underrated that nobody talks about this book more. I actually liked it more than Stephen King's It, personally. So that's what I would compare it to in terms of enjoyment and type of book it is in general. It's similar to that, but very different, stands on its own, and is unique. Number 9 is going to be a huge surprise for you guys. So I don't just have horror on this list. Number 9 is Just Like Magic. It is a romance book, and is the first pure romance book that I ever read in 2022 for a special, horror reader tries romance reading vlog that I did during the month of November. I had so much fun doing the vlog. I was a little tentative and nervous, thinking that I would not like any of the books. However, Just Like Magic was the first romance book I picked up, and not only did I enjoy it, but I freaking went past that and loved it. There is humor, there is heart, there is just zaniness all up in this book. Essentially, we've got the plot, we've got this kind of mean girl who used to be a rich girl, like her family, who is also rich, but she kind of squandered her wealth with some bad decisions, and she's trying to hide that from her family. So one day, she's kind of wallowing in self-pity and, thinking about how terrible her circumstances are, and she accidentally plays a Mariah Carey album backwards, and it's like a holiday album, and it conjures the holiday spirit, and it's in the form of a man, and he can grant her wishes. He can also try to bring her cheer, and that's what he's there for, to try to lift her holiday spirits and get her in the holiday mood. So she ropes him into going with her to visit her family, pretends to be her boyfriend, and lots of funny things ensues. She kind of gets won over by his charm and his naivete, if that makes sense, because he's very naive about things. He loves Cracker Barrel, so there's some Cracker Barrel references that I could relate to, because I also love Cracker Barrel. He walks into a Cracker Barrel and he's like, is this heaven? Because he likes all these kitschy things that Cracker Barrel happens to carry in their little store. Anyway, so many great pop culture references. Just a lot of fun from beginning to end, but it still tugged at my heartstrings. I cannot believe a romance book has made my top 10, and the reason it had to be on this list is because it surprised me so much. I had to put it here and leave off some other things just because I was really just floored and flabbergasted that I actually enjoyed it to the level that I did. So I think it deserves to be here for that reason alone. Number 8, The Midnight Club by Christopher Pike. This is not a horror book. I've been saying this throughout multiple videos throughout the end of 2022 into this year in 2023. I don't want people going into this book thinking that it's horror or it's even cheesy YA goodness. No, this is a serious emotional book. We are following a group of teens who are staying at a hospice, and they gather around at midnight and tell spooky stories. In some cases, the stories aren't even spooky. They might be exciting, whatever. The whole idea is they're coming together to bond, to have something to take their minds off of these terminal diseases that they are fighting, and to kind of come to grips with what they're facing. So, having said that, it's really more of an emotional book, really more of an examination of grief and how to cope with such a terrible diagnosis, how to cope with the idea you might die young, and also stuff of that nature. Are there religious elements in here? Yes, but it's not forced down your throat like religion, religion, religion. It's not like that at all. If it was like that, I wouldn't have liked it. I feel like it was a respectful conversation and really touched me personally for different reasons that I've mentioned in other videos.
Oh, you paused.
Well,
I've been waiting outside the door and you had a pause. That's when I came in.
It's fine, thank you. BLEs. Anyway, if you don't mind a book with a lot of emotion and that examines deeper issues, I'd say give this book a chance. It really is quite lovely, and it means so much to me. I remember my time with this book forever. I cried so much. Cried buckets and buckets of tears with this book. Number 7 of my top 10 best reads of 2022, Needful Things. You might not be able to tell what it is. I took the slipcover off. I never put it back on after I finished reading it, so it is what it is. I read this with my eyes, but I also listened to the audio, which was narrated by Stephen King, and he narrated some of the characters' lines in here just perfectly to a T, made you laugh. Especially this one preacher character, the way he narrated him was to die for. Just hilarious and over the top, but in the best way. And I just had a great time with this book. This is a great book if you love a lot of characters, because this definitely has a lot of characters. It is a chunker, but I really like the idea of an outsider coming into this small town, setting up shop. Almost seems like it's a nice antique shop. However, customers are getting more than what they bargained for when they go there and make deals with this guy in order to get things they want from the shop. Essentially, eventually this town, it descends into chaos. Things go to hell. Wink. And yeah, there's a great villain in here. I don't want to say too much about it. A lot of people know this premise already. It's a semi-popular Stephen King book, but I wasn't expecting it to be one of my favorite Stephen King books that I read in all of 2022. This one was really awesome. I wanted only to put one Stephen King on this top 10 list, so here's a spoiler. I will not include any other Stephen King books in this top 10. Cujo almost made it, but I really had a good time with this one. I liked Cujo for different reasons. It's kind of hard to compare the two, but out of the two, I chose to put this one on my top 10 because I only wanted one King on this top 10 list, because there's lots of other authors to celebrate, lots of other great reads that I have that weren't King. So, but this is the King that made it, and it made it at number 7, officially on this list. By the way, guys, I did release a top 10 in the middle of the year, so I think at the end of June, beginning of July, I released my top 10 of the year so far. And you guys can see how much this list has changed from then to now, because there have been some things that have been omitted, but a book that was on my top 10 list from the halfway point of 2022 is The Troop. So The Troop is still here, and this time it lands at number 6 on my overall top 10 of 2022 list. I love The Troop. I think it's great if you like body horror, but it's more than just gore and gruesomeness. It's got some freaking tough things that it examines: friendship, loyalty, all kinds of things. There is some animal cruelty in here. There are some very difficult scenes to read, so I would look up trigger warnings if you're worried. It will not be for everyone. However, I do think the themes of the book go far past the gruesomeness of the story. I feel like the message it's trying to say is just bigger than the gore that a lot of people talk about this for. Like, a lot of people are like, it's great body horror. It is. There are some really harrowing body horror scenes described in this. However, the ending is just like, I could talk about the ending for an hour. What did it mean? Did it mean this or that? You know, how do you interpret it? That kind of thing. That doesn't really give anything away. If you've read it, I think you might know what I mean, but if you haven't, read it and check it out. But be warned, it is kind of gory, it is kind of gross and hard to read, but that is why I liked it. At least one of the reasons why I liked it. Alright, and now we're in our top 5 of the list. At number 5, we've got Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. I love this book, and I think something I learned about myself in 2022 is that I love characters. I just love a good character-driven story. I do like a plot-driven story too, but I think I seem to gravitate towards stories with very strong characters and really, like I said, well-rounded, well-developed, well-fleshed-out characters overall. This definitely had that, and the setting was a banger too. The setting, we're following this entire small town to where basically you feel like you know everyone in the town, and you feel like you know the town backwards and forwards overall in general. But this city-based family decides to leave the city and move to this small town, and decides to live life in a different way, live life in the small town way. But I think they got more than they bargained for when they moved to this small town, because things aren't what they appear to be on the surface. And the family, specifically the husband of the family, the head of the family, he finds that out eventually. I love this book, lots of atmosphere, slow burn though, not for everybody. Again, you have to have an appreciation for characters, and you have to be able to handle a slow burn. I thought the writing was fantastic, and the vibes were immaculate. If you like folk horror, this has you covered. That's not really giving away anything. This is kind of a famous folk horror type of book, so hell yeah. I loved it, and I'm so glad I read it. I have read 2 books so far by Thomas Tryon, and I'm going to read my 3rd, which will be The Other, this year in 2023, and I can't wait. Number 4, Krampus. Krampus was so good by Bram, bitch. Bram, I need to read more. God, he's so amazing. And I only say that after having just read 1 book, but I've also heard fantastic things about his other books from my friend Amy over at the channel Amy Noel Reads. Check out her channel. She is fantastic. She read 3 Bram books in 2022, and she gave them all between a 4.5 and a 5-star rating. And she gave this one a 5-star specifically, just like I did. So this was a 5-star. Not only was the text and the prose amazing, but the audiobook narration, which I used to listen along as I read, was out of this world. Fantastic. The voice of Krampus was my favorite. I mean, the narrator's doing different voices throughout the book. It's the same narrator, but his voice for Krampus was awesome, because 1 second he makes Krampus sound menacing, and the other second he makes Krampus sound nice and caring. It's awesome. Just the dichotomy of the character is so well portrayed and so well acted with the audio. It's fantastic. But the story itself, I know not everyone loved it as much as me. My friend Katrina, she gave it like a 4 or 4.5. Because she didn't like the main character as much. She wanted more Krampus and Santa. However, I loved everything. I loved the main character we were following, which is this kind of poor guy trying to make ends meet, but he's caught up in some trouble with like the local mafia. And then he stumbles across like Krampus's helpers, and he sees the battle between Krampus's helpers and Santa's minions, and he's like, what? And he gets caught up in the whole thing. And then you just have to read it to find out how everything plays out. This was so much more than I expected it to be. It had a lot of depth to it. It had a lot of mythology in it, in a way, because Bram wove things in from mythology, and he wove things in from the legend of Krampus itself. So lots of things at play, and I think it all worked really well together. Nothing clashed, and it was just such a solid book, and that is why it lands at number 4 on my list. Okay, and now into the top 3. Dun dun dun. The top 3. Specifically, number 3 and number 2, they were hard to decide which one should be 3 and which should be 2, because I love these next 2 so much, but for different reasons, and they're totally different books. So I just was like, whatever. I hemmed and hawed about it for a while, and then I finally decided. So number 3, but it could have been in another time and place, it could have been number 2, because I enjoyed both 3 and 2 very, very much. Number 3, though, is Clowns vs. Spiders. I have praised this book so much. I talked about it in my Kelseys Choice Awards book awards ceremony that I just recently released, which I will link below if you want to hear more of my thoughts of this book. This is so fun. We're following a group of clowns who you have to suspend your disbelief, because yes, they do believe they're actual clowns. It's not, actors playing clowns. It's clowns who believe in a clown code and want to uphold and pay respects to the clown code. And they don't want to give clowns a bad name. They want to work in a circus and make people laugh. They don't want to work in a haunted house and scare people, because that's just feeding into the stereotype of clowns being scary, which they are vehemently against. They don't like the idea that clowns are being portrayed in pop culture as scary. But because of dire straits, they end up having to work in a haunted house, and they don't really acclimate very well to it, let's just say that. But meanwhile, some spiders get loose, some big-ass spiders, I should say, not just any spiders, and the clowns find themselves in the midst of these spiders. And as the title suggests, we do get a showdown between the clowns and the spiders, and it's hilarious, it's absurd. If you don't mind a book that doesn't take itself seriously, then I'd say pick this up. If you like a book with action, mixed with comedy, mixed with some gore, also pick this up. Fantastic characters, fantastic dialogue. I think one of Jeff Strand's best traits as a writer is his ability to write funny dialogue, his ability to essentially convey sarcasm and convey an attitude and an absurdist type of persona with his dialogue and through his dialogue. All those different things all conveyed throughout different lines of dialogue spoken by different characters. So I can't say enough good things. This was definitely my favorite comedy horror read of the year because it made me laugh so much, and it's the first time ever a horror book, or any book for that matter, made me laugh to the extent that this made me laugh. I read it all the way back in February of 2022, and I still remember it like it was yesterday, and I'd love to revisit it one day in a future year perhaps. It will be fun to go back and just read some of the lines that made me giggle and chuckle, and I can't wait to go back at some point. I do highly recommend it if you do like horror comedy. If you don't and you like more serious types of horror, then maybe steer clear of this one. And number 2, Geek Love, a completely different type of book than Clowns vs. Spiders. Clowns vs. Spiders is zany, out there. This is also zany and out there, but in a much different way. This is very seriously focused on characters. This is another character-driven story. We are basically following this carnival family who are trying to keep their traveling carnival afloat. So the mother and father, the heads of the family, they decide to breed their own freaks to ensure the longevity of the carnival. And things get even crazier from there. Really, the characters are so twisted, so flawed, so multifaceted. My favorite character, maybe that I've read all year long in 2022, was the character in this, our main character and our narrator, Ollie. Ollie was fantastic. She was just so lovable, and even though she had flaws and she had things that she was dealing with and she had conflictions about how she felt about her family and what they were doing because they were doing terrible things, she's still lovable despite all of that. And maybe because of all of that. And I've said all of this in my awards ceremony, so excuse me if you've already heard me say this, but this is such a good book. Should you go into this book thinking it's pure horror? I'd say no, you could be disappointed. I would consider this more of a literary fiction type of book. It definitely leans more towards that end of the spectrum versus a pure horror book in my mind. However, is that a con of the book? Hell no. It's actually written in such a beautiful way. I think that's actually a strength of the book, that it has this more literary style to the writing. It's just really amazing. We also have a fantastic setting, and we get to travel around with this carnival that we're following all across the United States. And there's some weird acts in this carnival, let me tell you. At one point, there are these flies buzzing about. This one specific act, they talk about the guy basically is a fly wrangler, and how he gets the flies to buzz about, and he has the little mini lassos. Is he has like feces like in the middle of the tent, and like he like has all these flies buzzing about, and he like does his little lasso, and he's like woo, and anyway, it describes in great detail how he wrangles the flies and this and that. It's one little small part of the book, not a large part, but even that I thought was fascinating. I was like, what the hell? I'm getting to learn about freaking fly wrangling at a traveling circus. Also, the word geek doesn't mean geek as in nerd, haha, which I do consider myself a proud geek nerd. Geek is a carny term for someone at a carnival who essentially bites the heads off of chickens and stuff like that. They call them geeks. Hence the name Geek Love. So it's a carny term, and I just love the title of the book as well. There's so much this book has going for it, and so glad I read it in 2022. It will stay with me for a very long time because I still remember it very vividly. And number 1, it will surprise nobody. I've talked about it since I read it. I talked about it since July. This spoiler was not on my midway check-in top 10 of 2022 because I hadn't read it yet. I read it right after I released my top 10, and I think I might have even edited in the video. I've already read a book that changed my whole top 10, and I put that in the video. So I will link actually my review when I finish this book and my immediate thoughts after finishing. I also did a book club review with spoilers for this book, so I'll link that below if you've already read this and want to hear more of my thoughts on this book. This is Boy's Life by Robert McCammon, and not only is this my favorite book of all time, this book taught me what it was like to kind of fall in love with an author's style. It taught me what it was like to actually feel like you have a favorite book. Because before, when people would ask me, well, what's your favorite book you've read so far? I really didn't know what to say. I had a lot of great books that I read that I loved, but I didn't have one that I could just say, this is my favorite of all time, hands down. After reading this book, I was like, hands down, this is my favorite. In fact, I put the book down 25% in, and I told my boyfriend, the way this is going, unless like something gets effed up in the way the story is told, I think this is going to wind up being my favorite book of all time. And I said that like 25% in. It was just the way it was written. Essentially, we're following Corey, who's our main character, and his group of friends. It is a coming-of-age book, which I seem to be partial to that type of story. I love coming-of-age stories. That's something I learned about myself in 2022. It's not for everybody. Not everyone loves them as much as me, but I really do like coming-of-age. It's just such a wonderful thing to examine your childhood and the loss of innocence and the examination of nostalgia and how that colors our memories and this and that. All that's explored here, but so much more. We're also getting to know characters in this small town. So there are a lot of characters in here, and hopefully others who pick this up don't get confused. But I think McCammon does a great job at making all the characters unique so that you don't get confused. And you're still focusing on Corey and his family at the center. And there's also a mystery at the center. Corey thinks he witnesses somebody at the scene of a crime, that him and his father come across this crime scene, and then Corey thinks he sees somebody, and he thinks he picks up a clue on the scene. And so he's grappling with this for like a whole year, but other things in his life take place over that year as well, and we follow him during that year and other things that go on. We have, stories of life and death, stories of hardship. We've got racism is examined in here, and so much great stuff. We do get the examination of, what it's like to grow up and look back on your childhood and why that's so different as an adult. We do have a little magical realism in here. This is not a horror book. Do not go in thinking this is a horror book. This is a fiction book. I would say this is a coming-of-age fiction story. It's marvelous. I can't say enough great things. I mean, look at the tabs. Look at the tabs. And since I've read this book, I have read at least 6 other books by Robert McCammon, and I've really enjoyed them all. There's only been one that I haven't absolutely loved, and that was one of his first novels that he himself doesn't love either, because he was still trying to learn his craft. This is McCammon at the peak and the top of his craft. So I wouldn't even read this as your first McCammon. I would say this towards the end of your McCammon journey, if you're someone who likes to read McCammon, because this is really the cream of the crop when it comes to any kind of book, in my opinion, but specifically when it comes to Robert McCammon, at least of what I've read from him so far. But I've really liked all of his work a lot so far. I just finished Wolf's Hour by him, and that was fantastic too. Blew my mind how much research he did to make that historically accurate for the most part, but while also weaving his own fiction into it as well. And it was a very unique type of fiction he wove into it. Anyway, back to this. You can't go wrong. You can't go wrong. If you like coming of age, you're doing yourself a disservice by not getting to this one, because I think this could be the best coming of age book ever written. Is that a strong statement? Yeah, but I don't care, bitch, because I love you, I love you. By the way, I did get to meet Robert McCammon in 2022, and it was a dream come true, and he was so nice. So not only does he write, basically, in my opinion, masterpieces, but he's also a freaking awesome, nice guy. They say don't meet your heroes, but he was awesome and super nice to meet, so in his case, you don't have to be afraid. He is nice in person, so yay. And before we go, I do want to give some shout outs to a few honorable mentions that almost made the list. Tastes Like Candy by Ivy Tholen, Book of the Damned by D.A. Fowler, The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum, I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid, Mystery Walk by Robert McCammon, that was another 5-star Robert McCammon read for me, and Brother by Anya Alborn. All of those books were fantastic. I loved them all. They were all, I think, 5 or 4.5 stars. And speaking of other reads that were 4.5 or 5-star reads for me, I will be doing a follow-up video to this, kind of taking a look at all of my 4.5-star reads and all of my other 5-star reads that did not make this list. And I'll be calling it my standout reads of 2022. So again, it won't be my top 10, but it'll be essentially everything else that I really enjoyed and do recommend that I read in 2022. But for this video, that is my official top 10, and those are my honorable mentions. Did any of these books appear on your top 10? I would love to know. What are some standout reads that you had in 2022? Also let me know that in the comments, because I'd be interested to hear that as well. But for this time, guys, that is it for me. Thanks for spending time with me. Till next time, you guys know what you can do. Keep on killing it. Bye, guys.